Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. I would like to discuss this a video that's taking the rounds. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa telling President Macron of France that the West should give back Africa what you have taken for 400 years, plus 20% interest. A bold statement indeed. What I find really interesting, or rather disappointing, about our African leaders is how they've failed to attend to the problems of the continent and are always looking for excuses. South Africa is fast becoming just another failed African state. This is tragic because South Africa had the potential to become, or to remain, it was at one point one of the well-developed countries in Africa. And the last 30 years of the ANC government, of which President Cyril Ramaphosa is the president at the present moment, has seen that country's economy go downhill. This is the fact that we have got to deal with. South Africa is becoming a failed state. Some of the countries like Zimbabwe, we are a failed state. We have reached that point already, confirmed. There's no denying it. And here is South Africa first becoming one, another failed state. And the reason for it? Gross mismanagement, rampant corruption. What is interesting here is that some of our African leaders, as in this case here, President Cyril Ramaphosa, is very aggressively addressing the issue of colonialism by the West, by the Western countries. Rightly so. But I find it ridiculous that you're trying to address the problem when you're failing to govern yourself. When some of the countries like Zimbabwe, we look back today at the colonial days as the golden age because of 43 years in the case of Zimbabwe of gross mismanagement, rampant corruption, and tyrannical oppression. What is worse is that in the case of Zimbabwe, we really pushed out the British through the front door and let in the Chinese and the Russians, rather foreigners, through the back door. There's no denying that the last 43 years, countries like China have benefited from the chaos in Zimbabwe. Indeed. I think we cannot deny that they have masterminded some of that chaos. When Mugabe fell out with the Chinese in 2016, booted them out of Marange diamonds, for instance. They must have wriggled a finger at him, warning one, because within a year or two, he himself, Mugabe, was booted out of power by his own pigs in a coup. And guess what? The Chinese were back. And they've been back in Marange. They've been back with vengeance. Whatever the British were doing, what the Chinese have been doing to Zimbabwe cannot be swept under the carpet. And Africa is in serious trouble because some of these Eastern countries, China and Russia in particular, who have helped Africa end white Western colonialism, they've done so not because they wanted to see Africa free, but because they wanted the West out so that they could become the new power in Africa. Africa has got so many resources, so much potential, and yet we are the poorest continent on earth. And all this grandstanding by leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa, when we can't run our own countries, it's laughable. Indeed, we in Zimbabwe, we have got to say we are not happy with what is happening in South Africa, particularly when the same ANC government led by Cyril Ramaphosa last November vowed that they will not allow regime change in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, we have had a problem with rigged elections. Ever since our independence, we have yet to hold free, fair, and credible elections. If there is one legacy that the late Nelson Mandela left South Africa, was that he left that country with a fairly strong democratic institutions. And South Africa has managed these last 30 years to hold free, fair, and credible elections. That must be applauded. And here is a country that has successfully held free, fair, and credible elections. Now wants to turn to its northern neighbor and pretend that the elections are free, fair, and credible. Because in exactly 9 days' time, Zimbabweans will go to the polls. These elections, it's already clear that they are flawed. It's already clear that Zanu PF is rigging these elections. We are where we are. The best hope out of this is for these elections to be declared null and void because of the blatant cheating, the wanton violence, and the many irregularities, such as the fact that the ruling party, Zanu PF, is literally selling the nation's silver to bankroll these elections. Zanu PF has been spending money as if it's nothing. has been bribing everybody, from the ordinary people with pieces of chicken and chips at his rallies and drinks, to buying 60,000 US dollars worth of twin truck for the chiefs. And for those higher up, like the judges and the election supervision commissioners, they've all received what the government called a housing loan worth US $400,000. Just a few weeks before the elections. It cannot be denied that this was just a bribe. Zanu PF is desperate to win these elections, and it realizes that he'll need to bribe all those involved with the election process. And that's exactly what the party is doing. And our only hope to end this cycle of rigged elections is that these elections really should be declared null and void. And here we are, because South Africa now saying, no, whatever happens, we will not allow regime change in Zimbabwe. And South Africa, being the dominant country in the SADC region, is likely to influence SADC election observers to turn a blind eye to all these irregularities, so that Zanu PF is once again granted political legitimacy at the end of these elections. Of course, Zanu PF's handlers like China will only be too pleased with that. There's no doubt that China is helping Zanu PF rig these elections, directly or indirectly. And has been doing so for years. It is in China's interest to keep a corrupt and incompetent regime in power, because China has benefited from the looting that has been going on here. And now we have got our own neighbor. Instead of helping the country, the ordinary people of Zimbabwe, get out of the mess we are in, is now stepping in and propping up the dictatorship. It's laughable. This is the same country now, same president who is pretending he can take the West head on and ask for, give us back what you've taken from us for 400 years, plus 25% interest. I think he's just saying it to hide his own failures. Like I said, South Africa is a failed state. South Africa is fast becoming just another failed African country. To be fighting for what we lost the last 400 years, when we are losing billions now, is laughable. Why don't we address the problems that we're facing now? In fact, these ex-colonial powers, we can only address them from a position of strength, not a position of weakness. And yet, instead of addressing the opposition of weakness, the problems why we are weak, we are diverting attention, pretending that everything is okay. I think it is laughable. It is ridiculous, in fact, that we should find ourselves in this situation where nobody is going to take us seriously. Absolutely nobody. When we can't manage our own affairs and countries like China and Russia are taking advantage of us, we pretend to take on the West just to get away from our own, addressing our own problems. Who are we kidding? We in Zimbabwe have a problem of a corrupt, tyrannical regime that has ruled the country with an iron fist. In 9 days' time, we'll be going to an election, which by all accounts is completely a waste of time, because it is clear that Zanu PF, these elections are not going to be free, fair, and credible. And for us, this is our opportunity to have these elections declared null and void so that we can have a government of national unity and hopefully have the democratic reforms the country has been dying for all these years finally implemented. Only a democratic Zimbabwe can really seriously start addressing the underlying problems of gross mismanagement, rampant corruption, and tyrannical rule, and get this country back on track. We are a failed state and have become the textbook example of a failed state. The last thing we want is for South Africa to interfere and declare and make sure that Zanu PF, regardless of the evidence that the electoral process is flawed, is granted legitimacy. And thus, the failed state extended for another 5 more years. The reason South Africa is doing all this is really very simple and very clear. South Africa is becoming a failed state. Some people will say it is already a failed state. And 30 years of ANC rule have been a total disaster for that country. South Africa is realigning itself because it really is trying to abandon democracy, the rule of law. I wouldn't be surprised if for the first time next year, because South Africa is going to elections next year, that we start hearing problems of the elections not being free, fair, and credible in South Africa. And South Africa is realigning itself with Russia and China. or rather ANC is realigning South Africa with Russia and China for the purposes of getting support from those countries. If your elections are not free, fair, and credible, and they've got some backers like Russia and China, as Zanu PF knows only too well, you can get away with anything. What South Africa does, what becomes of South Africa, should be the right of the South Africans themselves to deal with. What I, as a Zimbabwean, object to is the way South Africa is trying to use Zimbabwe to further its own end. There is absolutely no excuse for SADC to endorse these coming elections as free, fair, and credible. No excuse whatsoever. The evidence of the violence, the blatant cheating, the failure to produce a verified voters roll, etc., are there. And SADC should be able to turn around and say, no, these elections, we can't endorse them. But given South Africa's position in SADC, it is most likely that ANC would want, as it has already vowed, that it doesn't want to see regime change in Zimbabwe. And so therefore then will pretend all these irregularities are nothing and grant Zanu PF political legitimacy and condemn Zimbabwe to another 5 more years of this failed state. This is more important to us than this fight with the West for redress of 400 years of colonial oppression. If there was to be compensation at all, in fact, it will only be benefiting those in power. It will only give them more reason to stay in power. And in the first instance, in the case of Zimbabwe, it is giving them something to divert attention from the problems that the country is facing. We want to talk about the problems that are affecting Zimbabwe right now. Let's sort those out and stop coming up with these imaginary problems. Imaginary in the sense that you cannot fight for this compensation from a position of weakness. Even if President Ramaphosa wanted to take on the French on this and the rest of the West on these issues, what we are concerned about is why is he vowing that he will not allow regime change in Zimbabwe? What has that got to do with Zimbabwe? SADC is in Zimbabwe right now. To assess as an election observer, to see whether those elections are free, fair, and credible. And to say that they will endorse those elections just to get at the West is the most ridiculous argument. Are we saying that the people of Zimbabwe's right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country is being suspended until the West does what Ramaposa wants? It's ridiculous. We are fighting for free, fair, and credible elections. For 43 years, Zimbabweans have been denied the right to a meaningful say. And we are not going to have that right forfeited just because Cyril Ramaphosa has got his own agenda with the West. We are not going to accept a situation where SADC endorses these elections again as free, fair, and credible and grant Zanu PF political legitimacy and extend and perpetuate the Zanu PF dictatorship. That position is totally untenable to us. We find it very difficult. We find it impossible to accept. We are not going to accept that. This is a position that must be condemned, and we condemn it strongly. We believe that the ANC government is trying to draw attention away from its own failures and has found a scapegoat in the West and is drumming up its problems with the West to the point of becoming ridiculous. To say that ANC will never allow regime change in Zimbabwe because it is Zimbabwe is under sanctions from the West is just a feeble excuse to allow Zanu PF to rig elections and get away with it. If we're going to fight the West, let's fight the West. But don't use other people. Sacrifice other nations in your fight with the West. We are not going to accept that Zimbabwe is somehow a pawn in this game that can be sacrificed by South Africa to advance its own agenda, whatever that agenda is. We do not accept that. We do not believe that these elections, these 2023 elections, are free, fair, and credible. And SADC knows that. Every SADC leader knows that. And if they're going ever to endorse these elections as substantially free, fair, and credible as they've done in the past, and thus grant Zanu PF political legitimacy, the only reason most of us will think of is because it was South Africa. Because the ANC government in South Africa had already made a vow that they will never allow regime change in Zimbabwe. And thus, they will never allow the ordinary people to have a meaningful say in the governance of that country. Supposedly, until South Africa gets its way with the West. And getting its way with the West is for the West to give Africa back what Africa took, what the West took from Africa the last 400 years, plus 25% interest. Well, that is a fight we don't want to be involved in. At least we don't want to be a pawn in that fight. And here we are being used as a pawn. We totally reject that. SADC has got a task. Zimbabwe is holding is going to the poll in 9 days' time, and we expect SADC to condemn these elections for what they are, a flawed and illegal process, because that is what they are. To keep Zanu PF in power just because South Africa finds that convenient is totally unacceptable. Zimbabweans have suffered for 43 years. Zimbabwe is a failed state because the country has failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Zimbabwe is a failed state because the country is stuck with a corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical Zanu PF regime. To be told that that regime will not be changed is an insult. And in an insult that we are not going to take sitting down. We totally reject ANC's argument that they will not allow regime change in Zimbabwe as long as the West impose sanctions on the West are still have not been lifted in Zimbabwe. We welcome the sanctions in Zimbabwe because they highlight the problem of human rights abuses by that regime, the failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections, and to pretend somehow that that is the root cause of Zimbabwe's economic meltdown is a nonsense. The root cause of Zimbabwe's economic meltdown is gross mismanagement and rampant corruption. Just as South Africa is fast becoming a failed state because of gross mismanagement and rampant corruption. Why is it that South Africa accepts that their own leaders can be removed from office because they've been accused of corruption, and yet they refuse to accept the Zimbabwean leaders are corrupt? This is becoming a serious problem for us. As much as we would like to see South Africa prosper, as much as we would like to see South Africa take its own foreign policy, whatever that position may be, but what we cannot accept is for South Africa to use Zimbabwe as a pawn in this game. We refuse to be used as a pawn in this game. We have got our own problems, and our present problem is the failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections, the failure to remove a corrupt and incompetent and tyrannical regime. We failed to do that for 43 years, and to be told we are not going to do it now, as long as the Western sanctions are still in place in Zimbabwe, is an outrage. It's totally unacceptable. And we reject that argument completely. My last word as Zimbabweans is that South Africa should seriously think about this problem and should make sure that these elections, SADC looks at what is there on the ground, the evidence of these elections, and condemn them for what they are, flawed and illegal. And to think that South Africa is going to impose its own will just to keep the Zanu PF regime in power because it will not accept regime change in Zimbabwe is something that we are not going to accept. This is something that we find absolutely unacceptable. That is our message to our friend, President Cyril Ramaphosa, across the Limpopo. Thank you and good night.